Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung the last of the washing on the line behind her small cabin. The Nebraska prairie stretched endlessly before her, golden wheat swaying in the afternoon breeze. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 3 days now, traveling to the nearest town to sell their grain harvest. She expected him back by tomorrow evening, but until then, she was alone with just their old dog Rex for company. The year was 1876, and life on the frontier demanded strength from everyone, especially women. Sarah had learned to handle a rifle, tend to injured animals, and manage their small homestead with the same skill her mother had once used to run a boarding house back in Pennsylvania. The isolation didn't frighten her anymore. After 2 years in this remote valley, she had grown accustomed to the vast silence broken only by whine through the grass and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. As evening shadows began to lengthen, Rex suddenly lifted his head from where he had been dozing in the shade. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah paused in her task of collecting eggs from their small chicken coop and listened carefully. At first, she heard nothing unusual, but then came the sound that had alerted her faithful companion, the distant thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Sarah's heart quickened. Visitors were rare in this isolated part of the territory, and those who came riding hard usually brought trouble. She quickly secured the chickens and made her way to the cabin, retrieving Thomas's rifle from above the fireplace. Through the small window, she could see a lone rider cresting the hill about half a mile away. The figure swayed dangerously in the saddle, and even from this distance, Sarah could tell something was terribly wrong. The horse stumbled as it approached, and suddenly, the rider pitched forward, sliding from the animal's back to land heavily in the dirt just 50 yards from her front door. Sarah waited several long moments, watching for any sign of movement. When none came, she stepped outside, rifle ready but pointed at the ground. Rex growled low in his throat but stayed close to her side. The fallen man wore buckskin clothing and had long black hair that spilled across his face. Dark stains covered his shirt, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that he was seriously injured. As she drew closer, she could see he was breathing, but barely. Blood seeped from what appeared to be a bullet wound in his shoulder, and another wound on his side had soaked his clothing. Sarah knelt beside him carefully, still maintaining her grip on the rifle. The man appeared to be a Native American, likely from one of the Sioux tribes that occasionally passed through this region. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of significant blood loss. Without immediate help, he would surely die. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Relations between settlers and the local tribes were tense at best, and she had heard countless stories of raids and violence on both sides. Thomas had always warned her to be cautious around any Native Americans she might encounter. But looking down at this wounded man, unconscious and helpless, she saw only another human being in desperate need of care. Making her decision, Sarah set the rifle aside and began the difficult task of getting the injured scout into her cabin. He was heavier than he looked and completely unconscious, making the process challenging for someone of her small stature. She managed to drag him to the porch steps, then had to employ a makeshift pulley system using rope and the porch beam to get him inside. Once she had him lying on the floor near her kitchen table, Sarah could better assess his injuries. The bullet wound in his shoulder was still bleeding, though not as heavily as the gash on his side, which appeared to have been made by a knife or tomahawk. Both wounds would need immediate attention if she was to save his life. Sarah had experience treating injuries from her time, helping the local doctor back in Pennsylvania, and she had successfully cared for various wounded animals since moving to the frontier. She gathered her supplies, clean cloth for bandages, her sewing kit, whiskey for sterilization, and the small bottle of laudanum she kept for emergencies. Working by lamplight, she carefully cleaned both wounds, noting that the bullet had passed through his shoulder without hitting any major bones. The side wound was more concerning, deeper, and with ragged edges that suggested a struggle. She stitched both injuries with the same careful precision she used when mending Thomas's work clothes, pausing frequently to wipe away blood and check the man's breathing. Throughout the long night, Sarah kept watch over her unexpected patient. She managed to get small amounts of water past his lips and covered him with her warmest quilts. His fever rose as the hours passed, and he began to murmur words in a language she didn't understand. Sometimes his eyes would flutter open, but he seemed to see through her rather than registering her presence. By morning, the fever had broken slightly, and his breathing had grown stronger. Sarah had dozed fitfully in her rocking chair beside him, waking every hour to check his condition. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through her windows, she noticed that the bleeding had stopped completely, and some color had returned to his face. The scout's horse had remained near the cabin throughout the night, grazing peacefully in her small pasture. The animal was a magnificent paint horse, clearly well-trained and valuable. Sarah had given it water and some of her precious oats, noting the intricate beadwork on its bridle and the care with which its owner had obviously treated it. As she prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, Sarah wondered about the identity of the man she had saved. His clothing was finely made, with detailed quill work and beading that suggested he held some position of importance within his tribe. The weapon she had found beside him, a knife with an ornately carved handle and a tomahawk decorated with eagle feathers, also indicated that he was no ordinary warrior. What troubled Sarah most was wondering who had injured him so severely and whether they might still be pursuing him. She kept the rifle close at hand and found herself glancing frequently toward the windows, watching for any signs of other riders approaching her homestead. 3 days had passed since Sarah had found a wounded scout, and his condition had steadily improved under her careful nursing. The fever had completely broken on the second day, and by the third morning, he was able to take small sips of broth without assistance. However, he remained largely unconscious, drifting in and out of awareness like a man caught between two worlds. Sarah had grown increasingly anxious about Thomas's prolonged absence. He should have returned 2 days ago, and his delay worried her more with each passing hour. She tried to focus on caring for her patient, but her mind kept wandering to all the possible reasons for her husband's late return. Perhaps his wagon had broken down, or maybe he had encountered trouble on the trail. On the afternoon of the third day, as Sarah was changing the bandages on the scout's wounds, his eyes suddenly opened and focused directly on her face. For the first time since his arrival, she could see full awareness in his dark gaze. He tried to sit up, but immediately winced in pain from his injuries. "Please, don't try to move yet," Sarah said gently, placing a restraining hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Your wounds are still healing." The scout studied her face intently, clearly surprised to find himself in the care of a white woman. His eyes moved around the small cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the medical supplies scattered on the nearby table, and the rifle that Sarah kept within easy reach. When his gaze returned to her, Sarah was struck by the intelligence and dignity she saw there, despite his weakened condition. "Water," he said in heavily accented English, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah quickly brought him a cup of cool well water, supporting his head as he drank deeply. When he had finished, he lay back against the pillow she had placed beneath him and continued to study her with those penetrating dark eyes. "You saved my life," he said after a long pause. The words came slowly, as if he was carefully choosing each one from a vocabulary he seldom used in this language. "Anyone would have done the same," Sarah replied, though she knew this wasn't entirely true. Many settlers in this region would have left an injured Native American to die, or worse. "No," the scout said firmly, shaking his head slightly. "Not anyone. You chose to help when you could have chosen to let me die. This is a debt I will not forget." Over the next few hours, as the scout's strength returned, Sarah learned more about the man she had rescued. His name was Standing Bear, and he was indeed a scout for the Oglala Lakota, one of the bands of the Sioux Nation. He had been returning from a reconnaissance mission when he was ambushed by 3 men who had been tracking him for days. They were not soldiers, Standing Bear explained as Sarah helped him sit up to eat some of her vegetable stew. These men hunted me for sport, like I was an animal. They wanted my scalp to sell in the towns where such things bring money from bad white men. Sarah felt sick at the thought of such cruelty. She had heard rumors of bounties being paid for Indian scalps in some of the rougher frontier settlements, but she had hoped they were just ugly stories told to frighten women and children. Standing Bear went on to describe his escape from the ambush. He had managed to kill one of his attackers and wound another before taking the bullet in his shoulder. The knife wound had come during his desperate fight to reach his horse and flee into the night. He had ridden for hours, growing weaker from blood loss, before finally collapsing near Sarah's cabin. "The Great Spirit guided my horse to your door," he said with quiet conviction. "I should have died in that place, but instead I found a woman with a healing heart." As evening approached, Standing Bear was able to sit up for longer periods and even managed to eat a full bowl of stew. Sarah noticed that despite his weakened condition, he remained constantly alert to sounds from outside the cabin. His warrior's instincts had not been dimmed by his injuries. "You are afraid," he observed, noting how Sarah's eyes frequently went to the windows and door. "Your man has not returned when he should have." Sarah was surprised by his perceptiveness. "My husband went to town to sell our grain harvest. He should have been back 2 days ago." Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "The men who attacked me spoke of watching a wagon on the main trail. They said the driver would bring good money when they sold him to certain people who trade in human lives." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "There are bad men who take people to sell as workers in mines and factories far from here. They take both white people and Indians. Your husband may have been taken by such men." The possibility that Thomas had been kidnapped rather than simply delayed filled Sarah with a new kind of terror. She had imagined mechanical problems or bad weather, but the thought that he might be in the hands of criminals was almost too horrible to contemplate. Seeing her distress, Standing Bear struggled to sit up straighter. "I will help you find him," he said with determination. "You saved my life. Now I must save his." "You're in no condition to ride," Sarah protested. "You can barely sit up without pain." "I'm stronger than I appear," Standing Bear replied. "And I know the trails these bad men use. We must go soon, before they take your husband too far away." Sarah found herself facing an impossible decision. Her husband might be in terrible danger, but her only hope of finding him was this wounded Native American warrior whom she had nursed back from the edge of death. Everything she had been taught about her people and his suggested that trusting him was foolish and dangerous. Yet looking into Standing Bear's eyes, Sarah saw only honesty and determination. This man had given her his word, and she sensed that such a promise was not given lightly among his people. "If we're going to do this, we need to move carefully," she said finally. "I won't be responsible for reopening your wounds." Standing Bear smiled for the first time since awakening, transforming his serious features into something almost boyish despite the gravity of their situation. "You will see that the Lakota heal quickly when we have good reason to be strong." That night, Sarah helped Standing Bear test his mobility around the cabin. He was indeed stronger than she had expected, though she could see the effort it cost him to hide his pain. His shoulder wound was healing cleanly, but the deeper cut on his side would need more time. Still, he moved with the fluid grace of a natural horseman and warrior, even in his weakened state. They spent the evening planning their search for Thomas. Standing Bear knew the locations of several camps where criminals operated along the frontier trails, places where law enforcement rarely ventured. He explained the signs to look for and the precautions they would need to take to avoid walking into a trap themselves. As Sarah prepared for what might be the most dangerous journey of her life, she reflected on how drastically her world had changed in just 3 days. She had gone from being a lonely farm wife waiting for her husband's return to planning a rescue mission with a Sioux warrior she had saved from death. Dawn came cold and gray as Sarah made final preparations for their departure. Standing Bear had insisted on checking his weapons and horse despite Sarah's concerns about his injuries. His paint horse had remained close to the cabin, almost as if it sensed its master's condition and was waiting patiently for his recovery. Sarah packed medical supplies, food for several days, and extra ammunition for the rifle. She had never been away from the homestead for more than a few hours, and the thought of leaving everything behind felt like abandoning her entire life. But the possibility that Thomas was suffering somewhere, perhaps dying, made the decision inevitable. Standing Bear moved with careful deliberation as he prepared his gear. Sarah could see that each movement caused him pain, but his determination never wavered. He had fashioned a makeshift sling for his injured arm and wrapped his side tightly with strips of cloth to support the healing wound. "The men I seek will have taken your husband toward the Black Hills," he explained as he adjusted his horse's bridle. "There are hidden camps there where they hold people before moving them further west. If we are fortunate, he will still be in the first camp." They set out as the sun climbed above the horizon, with Sarah riding Thomas's sturdy workhorse while Standing Bear mounted his paint. Despite his injuries, the Lakota scout sat his horse with natural grace, and Sarah could see why his people were renowned as horsemen. The trail leading away from the homestead showed clear signs of the grain wagon's passage, along with the hoofprints of Thomas's riding horse tied behind it. Standing Bear studied the tracks with an intensity that impressed Sarah. He seemed able to read the story of their passage like words on a page. "Your husband made good time on the first day," Standing Bear observed, pointing to the spacing of the wheel ruts. The horses were fresh, and the wagon was not overloaded. "But here," he indicated a spot where the trail curved around a large boulder. "Here something changed." Sarah could see what he meant. The tracks became erratic, and there were signs of other horses joining the trail from a side canyon. Scuff marks in the dirt suggested some kind of struggle, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were looking at the site of Thomas's capture. Standing Bear dismounted carefully to examine the area more closely, moving in ever-widening circles around the disturbed ground. After several minutes, he returned to his horse with a grim expression. "Four men waited here for many hours before your husband arrived," he reported. "They knew he was coming and planned their attack well." The wagon continued on the main trail, but with different drivers. "Your husband was taken south toward the hills on horseback." Sarah felt tears threatening, but forced them back. Crying would not help Thomas now. "How long ago?" 2 days, maybe 3. "We can still catch them if we move quickly and do not stop for long rests." They followed the kidnappers' trail south across increasingly rugged terrain. Standing Bear proved to be an excellent tracker despite his injuries, spotting signs that Sarah would have missed entirely. Broken twigs, disturbed stones, and occasional hoofprints in soft ground told the story of their quarry's passage. As they rode deeper into the hills, Standing Bear shared more about the criminal network they were pursuing. These men operated outside all law, preying on both white settlers and Native Americans with equal cruelty. They sold their captives to mining companies, railroad construction crews, and other enterprises that needed workers who would not be missed. They are cowards who attack only those who travel alone or in small groups, Standing Bear explained. But they're also clever and know this country well. We must be very careful not to ride into an ambush. By midday, they had climbed high enough into the hills that Sarah could look back and see her distant homestead as a tiny speck on the vast prairie. The landscape around them had changed dramatically, with rocky outcroppings and thick stands of pine trees replacing the open grassland. This was unfamiliar territory for Sarah, but Standing Bear navigated it with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths many times. They paused to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Sarah noticed that Standing Bear was favoring his injured side more than he had that morning, and she insisted on checking his bandages. Blood had seeped through the cloth wrapped around his ribs, but the wound didn't appear to have reopened completely. "You should not be making this journey so soon after your injuries," Sarah said as she tightened the bandage. "This could kill you." "Many things could kill me," Standing Bear replied calmly. "But failing to repay a debt of honor would kill something more important than my body. Among my people, a man who does not keep his word is already dead." They remounted and continued following the increasingly faint trail. Standing Bear had to dismount several times to study the ground closely, and Sarah could see the effort was taking a toll on his strength. Still, he pressed on with unwavering determination. Late in the afternoon, they came upon a small clearing where the kidnappers had made camp the previous night. The ashes of their fire were still warm, and Standing Bear found clear evidence that Thomas had been held there. "Your husband is alive and not badly hurt," he announced after examining the area. He walked around the camp, and his footprints show no sign of limping or weakness. They're treating him well because he is worth more to them healthy. This news lifted Sarah's spirits considerably. At least Thomas was alive and apparently unharmed. Standing Bear also found tracks indicating that the kidnappers' group had grown larger during the night. 3 more men joined them here, he reported. 7 men now travel with your husband. This will make rescue more difficult. As evening approached, Standing Bear made the decision to stop for the night rather than risk losing the trail in darkness. They made a cold camp with no fire, sharing Sarah's blankets and eating cold food to avoid detection. Sarah found herself studying this remarkable man who was risking his life to help her save her husband. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked as they settled down for the night. "You don't owe me your life. I did what any decent person would do." Standing Bear considered her question for a long moment before answering. "Among the Lakota, we believe that when someone saves your life, they become responsible for what you do with that life. But also you become responsible for their welfare. We are connected now in a way that cannot be broken." Sarah thought about this as she tried to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. In her world, such deep obligations between strangers were uncommon. People helped each other when they could, but they didn't consider themselves bound by honor to risk their lives in return. "What will happen when we find these men?" she asked. "We will free your husband and return him safely to you," Standing Bear said simply. "After that, the debt will be paid, and you'll be free to live your life as you choose." But even as he spoke these words, Sarah sensed there was more to Standing Bear's motivations than simple obligation. She had seen something in his eyes when he looked at her, a respect and admiration that went beyond gratitude. This proud warrior saw her as an equal, someone worthy of his protection and friendship, and that recognition meant more to her than she had expected. The second day of tracking brought them higher into the Black Hills, where the terrain became increasingly treacherous. Standing Bear's condition had worsened overnight, and Sarah could see that he was struggling to stay in the saddle. Still, he refused to rest, driven by his determination to fulfill his promise. Around midday, they reached a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the valleys below. Standing Bear studied the landscape with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey, then pointed toward a narrow canyon about 3 miles to the south. "There," he said quietly. "I can see smoke rising from where no fire should be. That will be their camp." Sarah strained her eyes, but could barely make out the thin wisp of smoke against the cloudy sky. Standing Bear's vision was remarkably keen, sharpened by years of scouting across vast distances. They approached the canyon carefully, leaving their horses tied in a hidden grove nearly a mile away. Standing Bear moved with the silent grace of a hunting cat despite his injuries, teaching Sarah how to place her feet to avoid making noise on the rocky ground. As they drew closer to the kidnappers' camp, Sarah began to hear voices and the occasional whinny of horses. Her heart pounded as she realized they were about to face 7 armed men with only Standing Bear's expertise and her own desperate courage. From a concealed position among the rocks above the camp, they could see the entire layout below. 7 rough-looking men sat around a campfire, passing a bottle between them and laughing at crude jokes. Thomas was tied to a tree at the far edge of the camp, alive, but looking exhausted and frightened. Several other prisoners were bound nearby, including 2 Native American women and an elderly Mexican man. "They collect people like others collect horses," Standing Bear whispered grimly. "We must free them all." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they faced. Rescuing Thomas had seemed difficult enough, but attempting to free multiple prisoners from 7 armed criminals appeared nearly impossible. Standing Bear studied the camp layout with professional attention to detail. The guards are careless because they think no one will follow them here. 3 of them are drunk already, and the others are not watching carefully. This gives us an advantage. He outlined a plan that seemed impossibly risky to Sarah. Standing Bear would circle around to the far side of the camp, where he could approach the prisoners unseen. Sarah would remain in position above the camp with a rifle, ready to create a distraction when he gave the signal. "When you see me wave my hand, fire a shot into the rocks near their fire," he instructed. "They will think someone is shooting at them from this direction, and will take cover. That will give me time to cut the prisoners free and get them to safety." "What if something goes wrong?" Sarah asked, terrified at the thought of Standing Bear being captured or killed. "Then you must ride back to your homestead as fast as you can and warn other settlers about these men," he replied seriously. "Do not try to rescue me. Promise me this." Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see the wisdom in his plan. If they were both captured, no one would know what had happened to Thomas or the other prisoners. Standing Bear began his careful descent toward the camp, moving from rock to rock with painful precision. Sarah watched him disappear into the shadows below, then turned her attention to the kidnappers around the fire. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western hills, and she knew they needed to act soon or risk attempting the rescue in darkness. Minutes passed like hours as Sarah waited for Standing Bear's signal. She could see Thomas clearly now, sitting with his back against the tree trunk, his hands bound behind him. He looked unharmed, but defeated, probably believing that no rescue was coming. Suddenly, Standing Bear appeared at the edge of the clearing where the prisoners were held. Moving silently, he began cutting through the ropes that bound Thomas's hands. The other prisoners watched with growing hope as they realized what was happening. Standing Bear looked up towards Sarah's position and raised his hand. Taking careful aim with the rifle, Sarah fired a shot that struck the rocks just beyond the campfire, sending sparks and stone fragments flying. The kidnappers reacted exactly as Standing Bear had predicted, diving for cover and shouting warnings to each other about attackers in the rocks above. In the confusion, Standing Bear quickly freed all the prisoners and began leading them toward a ravine that offered concealment. But as the group of freed captives started to move, one of the kidnappers spotted them and shouted an alarm. "The prisoners are escaping." Gunfire erupted from the camp as the criminals realized they were being outmaneuvered. Sarah fired several more shots to keep them pinned down, but she could see that Standing Bear and the prisoners were exposed as they crossed an open area toward safety. Thomas stumbled and fell, exhausted from his ordeal. Standing Bear immediately turned back to help him, exposing himself to fire from the camp. Sarah watched in horror as one of the kidnappers took careful aim at the Lakota warrior. Without thinking, Sarah left her concealed position and scrambled down the rocky slope toward the camp, firing as she went. Her shots were wild, but they forced the gunman to take cover again. She reached the edge of the clearing just as Standing Bear helped Thomas to his feet. "This way," she shouted, leading them toward a different escape route she had spotted from above. The group ran desperately through the rocky terrain while bullets whistled past them. Standing Bear's injuries had reopened, and Sarah could see blood spreading across his shirt, but he continued to help the weakest prisoners keep pace. They reached the ravine safely, but the kidnappers were organizing a pursuit. Standing Bear collapsed against a boulder, breathing heavily and clearly in severe pain. "We cannot outrun them with the injured and exhausted people," he gasped. "You must take your husband and go. I will hold them here." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said firmly. "We came this far together, and we're finishing this together." Thomas, though weak from his captivity, had regained some of his strength and was helping the other freed prisoners move through the ravine. "Sarah, we need to keep moving," he called urgently. But before anyone could respond, the sound of many horses approaching echoed through the canyon. Sarah's heart sank, thinking the kidnappers had summoned reinforcements. Then, Standing Bear lifted his head and smiled despite his pain. "Those are not their horses," he said with satisfaction. "Those are Lakota horses." A war party of 20 mounted warriors appeared at the mouth of the ravine, their leader scanning the area until his eyes found Standing Bear. Sarah recognized the magnificent war bonnet and elaborate decorations of a chief, and she realized that help had arrived in the most unexpected form. The Lakota warriors quickly surrounded the kidnappers' camp, and the brief gunfight that followed ended with the criminals either dead or fleeing into the wilderness. Within minutes, the immediate danger was over. As the chief approached their position, Standing Bear struggled to stand despite his injuries. "My father," he said formally, "I have fulfilled my obligation to this woman who saved my life." Sarah's eyes widened as she realized that Standing Bear was the son of this imposing chief. No wonder he had carried himself with such natural authority despite his wounds. Chief Iron Eagle dismounted from his magnificent war horse and approached the group of exhausted survivors. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers and clothes decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of high rank among his people. His eyes, so similar to those of his son, held the same intelligence and dignity that Sarah had come to recognize in Standing Bear. The chief's gaze moved from his wounded son to Sarah, taking in her disheveled appearance, the rifle still clutched in her hands, and the obvious concern she showed for Standing Bear's condition. When he spoke, it was in the Lakota language, but his tone was respectful rather than hostile. Standing Bear responded in the same language, clearly explaining the events of the past several days. Sarah caught a few words she had learned during their journey together, but most of the conversation was beyond her understanding. She could see, however, that Standing Bear was describing her actions in saving his life and helping to rescue the prisoners. Thomas had moved to Sarah's side, putting his arm around her shoulders as they watched this extraordinary scene unfold. He was still weak from his ordeal, but his eyes were bright with amazement at the turn of events. "I can't believe you came after me," he whispered to his wife. "And with him, how did this happen?" Sarah quickly explained how she had found Standing Bear injured near their cabin and nursed him back to health. Thomas listened with growing astonishment as she described their partnership in tracking down the kidnappers. Chief Iron Eagle concluded his conversation with his son and turned his full attention to Sarah. When he spoke in English, his accent was less pronounced than Standing Bear's, suggesting more experience with the white man's language. "My son tells me you saved his life when you could have left him to die," the chief said solemnly. "He says you showed courage and kindness when most of your people would have shown only fear and hatred. This is a debt that cannot be repaid with simple gifts." Sarah felt intimidated by the chief's intense gaze, but forced herself to meet his eyes as she replied, "I did what anyone with a heart should do. Your son was dying, and I couldn't turn away from that." "You are wrong," Iron Eagle said firmly. "Many would have turned away. Many have turned away. But you chose differently, and that choice has created a bond that cannot be broken." The chief stepped closer to Sarah, and she could see the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of countless years leading his people through difficult times. When he continued speaking, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Among the Lakota, when someone saves the life of a chief's son, that person becomes part of our family. Not by blood, but by honor. This is our way, and it cannot be changed." Standing Bear had managed to stand despite his injuries, and he moved to stand beside his father. "I told this woman that I owed her my life," he said, "but the debt is greater than one man can repay alone. She showed mercy to an enemy when she had every reason to fear. She risked her own life to help me save her husband and the other prisoners. Such courage and honor must be recognized." Chief Iron Eagle nodded gravely, then raised his voice so that all the Lakota warriors could hear his words. What followed was clearly a formal pronouncement, delivered in the Lakota language with ritualistic precision. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she could feel the solemnity and importance of what was being said. When the chief finished speaking in Lakota, he turned back to Sarah and repeated his words in English. I, Iron Eagle, chief of the Bear clan of the Oglala Lakota, do hereby place this woman and her family under our eternal protection. Any harm that comes to them will be answered as if it were harm to our own children. This vow I make before the Great Spirit and all my warriors, and it will be honored by my sons and their sons until the end of time. The assembled warriors raised their weapons and voices in a chant that echoed through the canyon. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. This proud chief had just promised that his entire tribe would protect her family forever. Thomas squeezed Sarah's hand tightly, equally moved by the ceremony they had just witnessed. The other rescued prisoners watched in amazement, knowing they were seeing something that few white people had ever experienced. Standing Bear stepped forward and placed a beautifully crafted necklace around Sarah's neck. The piece was made of silver and turquoise with intricate designs that seemed to tell a story in their patterns. This belonged to my grandmother, he explained. She was a medicine woman known for her healing powers and her wise heart. My father, and I believe she would want you to wear it as a sign of the bond between our families. Sarah touched the necklace reverently, overwhelmed by the honor being shown to her. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected or deserved. It is exactly what you deserve, Iron Eagle said firmly. And it comes with responsibilities as well as privileges. You are now considered a friend to the Lakota people. That means you must be worthy of that friendship. Over the next hour, as the rescued prisoners recovered their strength and prepared for the journey home, Sarah learned more about the commitment she had entered into. The chief explained that the protection extended not just to her and Thomas, but to any children they might have and their children's children. In return, the Lakota expected her to treat their people with fairness and respect whenever their paths might cross. There will be difficult times ahead, Iron Eagle warned. The white settlers and the government soldiers do not understand our ways, and many of my people have grown bitter toward all whites because of the wrongs that have been done to us. But you have shown that not all of your people are enemies. This gives me hope that peace might still be possible. As the sun began to set, the group prepared to return to the prairie. The Lakota warriors would escort the rescued prisoners partway home before returning to their own territory. Standing Bear, despite his father's urging, insisted on accompanying Sarah and Thomas all the way back to their homestead. I will recover from these wounds, he told his father, but I will never recover from the shame of not fulfilling my complete obligation to this woman. Chief Iron Eagle smiled at his son's determination, clearly proud of the young man's sense of honor. You are truly my son, he said with satisfaction. The journey back to the Mitchell homestead took 2 full days, with the group traveling slowly to accommodate the injured and exhausted prisoners. Sarah rode beside Standing Bear, monitoring his condition and changing his bandages whenever they stopped to rest. Thomas had initially been somewhat uncomfortable with his wife's obvious friendship with the Lakota warrior, but he quickly came to appreciate the man's character and the depth of his commitment to protecting them. On the morning they reached the familiar sight of Sarah's cabin, Standing Bear finally allowed himself to show how much the journey had cost him. He was pale with exhaustion and barely able to remain in his saddle. Sarah and Thomas helped him into the cabin, where Sarah immediately set about cleaning and rebandaging his wounds. You should stay here until you're completely healed, Sarah insisted as she worked. You've pushed yourself far beyond what anyone should have to endure. Standing Bear smiled weakly, but shook his head. My father will be worried if I do not return soon, and my people need their scout to be with them. But I will not forget what you have done, Sarah Mitchell. None of us will forget. The next morning, Standing Bear was determined to leave despite Sarah's protests. His strength had returned somewhat after a night's rest, but he was clearly still in pain. Before mounting his horse for the journey back to his people, he spoke privately with both Sarah and Thomas. Remember what my father said about the protection of our tribe? He told them seriously. If trouble ever comes to you that you cannot handle alone, send word to any Lakota you encounter. Tell them you are the woman who healed Standing Bear, and they will help you. This I promise." As Standing Bear rode away across the prairie, Sarah stood watching until his figure disappeared into the morning haze. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, both of them marveling at how completely their lives had been changed by a single act of compassion toward a dying stranger. The silver and turquoise necklace rested against Sarah's chest, a constant reminder of the extraordinary bond that had been forged between two very different worlds. She knew that she would treasure not only the protection it represented, but the friendship and respect of the remarkable people who had honored her with their trust.